The Tom Woods Show, episode 2276.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey folks, chances are if you're listening to this podcast, you are surrounded by irrational, panicked people who think you're a terrible person because you don't want to lock everybody in their houses. No amount of reasoning appears to accomplish anything, and not to mention the media has done nothing but stoke fear and failed to provide context. Well, one of the many benefits you get as a supporter of the Tom Woods Show is membership inside the Tom Woods Show Elite. Recently migrated off Facebook, so if that was holding you back, no longer. This group will keep you sane and informed, and as an added bonus, it won't accuse you of wanting to kill your grandmother. Join me in there at supportinglisteners.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here, talking to Dan McCarthy today on the occasion of the retirement of Pat Buchanan from his syndicated column, which I've been reading for as long as I can remember. I think since I was in high school, I was reading Pat Buchanan's column, and I feel very much the way I felt not too terribly long ago when Thomas Sowell announced his retirement from his column when he was 83. I'm not sure. I know Pat is at least 80. Dan, do you happen to know off the top of your head what his age is? Somewhere around there.
He is 84, so
84.
He is a little older than Sowell was.
Okay, so he's given us all the service we can reasonably ask for at this point. Dan, as you all will recall, I hope from previous episodes, is the editor of Modern Age, the venerable journal dating back to 1957 that has published anybody who's anybody in the conservative movement and to some extent the libertarian movement as well. He is with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. So are you the director of the Collegiate Network? What's your title?
Well, I'm vice president for the Collegiate Network, and what that means is that I'm in charge of the student publications division. There are about 80 conservative, libertarian, independent campus papers all across the country that we help to support. We give them some money, we give them training in journalism, contact with professional journalists. We have an internship program, a fellowship program. So we really do everything we can to make sure that there are some journalists who have not just a certain amount of integrity, but also a familiarity with conservative and libertarian ideas. And, it's a program I'm an alumnus of myself. I was actually a student conservative journalist back in the mid and late 1990s. And that was how I got my start, was through the Collegiate Network. So I'm very honored to be its vice president now.
Dan, you are a little bit younger than I am, so I actually don't know how old you would have been in 1992 when Pat challenged George H.W. Bush in the Republican primary. Do you mind disclosing that information?
Yeah, I was 14 years old, and I was precocious enough that I was already getting interested in politics. And so even though I was learning about Pat Buchanan for the first time in 1992, he seemed by far the most interesting political figure out there, more so than Bill Clinton, of course, the Democratic nominee in 92, more so than George H.W. Bush, the incumbent Republican president. Pat Buchanan had a clear, distinct conservative philosophy. Certainly back then, I strongly was impressed by his credentials as a social conservative, which George H.W. Bush tried to triangulate, you might say, to use a later Clintonian term, between being a social conservative and being a kind of modern, compassionate Republican, whereas Buchanan was much more of a culture warrior. And I thought that clarity and that moral strength was one of the most commendable things about him.
Well, I suppose we could spend a few minutes on a general biography of the man, at least some of the highlights. I read his biography. I'm sure you did too, right from the beginning. Did you read that?
I did, yeah, many years ago.
It's written, of course, in Pat's signature style. I read recently, there was an article in The American Conservative, maybe you saw. It was called something like Against Buchananism or something like that. But what they meant by that was not that we're against Pat, but that the author was saying that most of what Pat stood for was really just common sense observations that other people would make if they weren't cowards. And so there's no reason that we should have a special name for this when it really is just a series of commonsensical observations. Well, and I mention that because I think a lot of people hear the name Pat Buchanan and they immediately think demon because they've been trained to think demon, whereas they hear Michelle Obama and they think philanthropist. People respond to the associations that I think are pushed on them, and certainly Pat didn't get a whole lot of favorable press, but in reality, everybody who interacted with him always said that he was the nicest guy around. When he was at MSNBC, people would go to him, even these lefties at MSNBC, when they needed advice. They knew Pat has a great strategic sense And so I'm going to go to Pat for advice. But this article in the American Conservative, almost as an afterthought, said that Pat may not have been a great writer, but blah, 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 blah. I actually disagree. I think he's a very crisp writer. I think he's one of the best. If he's not a good writer, then what hope is there for the rest of us? But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think I actually disagree with the premise of the article you've described. I didn't get to read that article myself. I'm sure the author was a smart person making some good points, but I have to say, I think Pat is an excellent writer. Consider about the sheer difficulty of writing a column every single week. And in Pat's case, he used to write more than one column a week as well, while also doing full books, while also appearing on television and generally being a pretty important public figure. The workload that Buchanan balanced and being able to write very well for a large audience that includes both intellectuals, but also just the ordinary Joe opening up his newspaper every day, that's an incredible talent. And I think, as is often the case with really great writers, the genius of their work is not conspicuous. People who don't understand the trade think that genius lies in being conspicuous and being flashy and having a literary style that really smacks you upside the head. With Buchanan, the fact that he is able to convey information as passionately and as eloquently, but to do it in a way that is not conspicuous and doesn't make you think, oh, look how writerly this prose is, that's actually a mark of much greater talent than somewhat flashier writers who, in fact, are, it's like comparing rock music to Beethoven, right? You may immediately grasp the appeal of rock music more quickly than you grasp the appeal of Beethoven or of Mozart or of Bach. But it's actually Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach who are the geniuses. As much as I may like AC/DC, they're not in quite the same league.
His books, by the way, I don't offhand know how many of them there were, but they were of very good quality. And of course, there were, let's say, right-wing radio hosts who released books on a regular basis, or television hosts. And when I say right-wing, I mean Conservatism, Inc. Like, I'm sure Sean Hannity wrote his share of books, but who could think reading a book by Sean Hannity, or let me put in quotation marks, by Sean Hannity, would be a good use of his time? Whereas whether or not you like Pat, you feel like at least he's going to give me some food for thought. And his book, A Republic, Not an Empire, is a great book. Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War touches the third rail. And that was an excellent book. And he thanks a couple of Mises Institute scholars in the acknowledgments of that book, Ralph Rako and David Gordon, who read the manuscript on that, having to do with World War II, and numerous other books as well. I already mentioned his autobiography. He had consistently valuable and interesting things to say. Now, I know I'm going to get complaints. Well, Pat Buchanan believed in X, Y, and Z, but I almost don't even want to acknowledge that. Yeah, okay, so maybe I didn't agree with everything Pat Buchanan thinks. Maybe I don't agree with everything Dan McCarthy thinks. Maybe I don't agree with everything my dad thought or whatever, but so what? It's still my dad. It's still Dan McCarthy. It's demoralizing when I hear stuff like that. Or sometimes on this show, I'll have somebody on and I'll get told, Tom, you got to have people other than just in your echo chamber as guests. So then I do that and they say, what? That guy's not a libertarian. I'm just tired of it. Pat was a smart guy who had important things to say and who was obviously a foreshadowing of politics that was to come later. And in a way, he was kind of saying, if you don't listen to me now, it's going to get much, much more contentious in the future. And indeed it did.
Yeah, I would say several things in response to all that. First of all, obviously, the best benchmark for a libertarian thinker who is absolutely a plumb line libertarian, someone who he certainly has his critics, but no one would be able to claim that he wasn't absolutely dedicated to libertarianism, and that's Murray Rothbard. And Rothbard, of course, he loved reading Pat Buchanan. He had his disagreements with him over trade and other issues, but Rothbard, I think, set a standard for the way that libertarians should read, interact with, and generally cultivate friendships with people who are not also libertarians. And the idea of any kind of intellectual movement just becoming a kind of echo chamber and almost like a religious cult or a cult, where you're only talking to other people who already agree with you, it's repellent. And Rothbard, I think, in his life always rejected that kind of approach, and rightly so. And on the other side, Pat Buchanan, even in The Great Betrayal, which is his book about trade, probably the book of all of Buchanan's that libertarians have the most objections to, I seem to recall that he also credits several Mises Institute scholars in that book. So, if you want to understand where people are coming from, what their arguments actually are, you need to interact with certainly the best work that they do. And that includes if libertarians want to understand where protectionists are coming from. Pat's book, The Great Betrayal, is definitely, I think, the first thing I would recommend for them.
You will, of course, recall, even if maybe you didn't watch it at the time, then maybe you watched it later, the famous convention speech Pat delivered in 1992 at the Republican convention. So he had run against the incumbent president in the primary and did creditably well, given that it was an incumbent president who, at his height, had been quite popular. After the Persian Gulf War, people may not remember this, but his approval ratings were at an almost unbelievable high 80%, almost 90%. And he seemed unstoppable. But Pat did a good job. Anyway, Pat gave this speech that it's interesting to recall Bill Bennett, who later accused Pat of famously of, quote, flirting with fascism. He liked the speech. Even Bennett, who was one of Pat's harshest critics, said, quote, it was a good speech, unquote. And it had been vetted by the Bush people. You know, could you imagine George H.W. Bush's people not looking at every single word Pat Buchanan was going to say? They had no problem with it. It was an excellent speech. And some people say Pat was declaring a cultural war on people. No, he wasn't. He was simply observing the existence of one. And if you didn't see it then surely by now you see it. I mean, surely by now nobody can deny there's an elite that is trying to push a certain set of ideas on the rest of us because they think we're all stupid and backward and we need to be enlightened by them. Maybe you didn't see that in 1992. Too bad for you. Pat did. And that was a real phenomenon that now we just see the more exaggerated and absurd version of it today.
And you know, millions of Americans did see it in 1992. And the way in which Pat's famous culture war speech has been received or recorded in history is a good illustration of these kind of Orwellian principles that a certain elite, which is, if not necessarily writing the textbooks, although they're doing that too, but is certainly writing the kind of received set of ideas of how things happened historically, how they can just slant things in their direction and people will believe it. So on the actual night of Pat giving that speech, my recollection is that, in fact, the ratings were very positive. The reaction was very positive. The audience, hearing it in person, they loved it. And it was only afterwards, when you had progressive and liberal journalists, left-wing journalists, starting to say, oh, this speech was terrible, it's polarizing, this is going to turn off voters, that you then had what you often have, and you still see this today, of course, where all of these sort of fair-weather conservatives, all these people who, you know, they were Republicans and they thought of themselves as being on the right, but in fact, anytime they're called on the carpet, anytime they're put to the test, they wind up simply saying, oh, that's not me, I'm one of the nice guys, I'm one of the compassionate conservative types. All these fair-weather conservative friends wound up then saying, oh yeah, this speech was terrible, I really hated it, I wish I hadn't been there. And of course, this is a successful operation for progressives. They want to say the Republican Party is divided. They want to say that conservatives are too radical. They need to be not only thrown out of politics and thrown out of office, but they even need to be thrown out of the Republican Party. If the Republican Party really had its own interests at heart, it would just get rid of people like Pat Buchanan. This narrative, which was, of course, a falsification of how the public received the speech and how conservatives and Republicans received the speech when Buchanan gave it, this narrative took hold. And I think it's a great lesson we've seen repeated over the last 30 years of just how taking your cues from what left-wing columnists in the New York Times and elsewhere tell you leads to having just a distorted view of even your own house, even your own reality, let alone sort of the wider world.
I remember, well, a couple things about this. First, I don't remember which news anchors it was, but if you actually go back to the night of the speech, you'll find a couple of the major network news anchors saying, well, great night for the Republicans tonight, 2 strong speeches and whatever. At the time, nobody was saying, oh my goodness, the Nazis have come to America. Nobody was saying that because nobody thought that, because people weren't quite as psychotic back then. And it reminds me of, now look, I'll admit that Dan Quayle wasn't the brightest guy in the world, but in one of the vice presidential debates that he was in, and I don't remember which one, I remember that when they did immediately afterward, they polled America who won that debate, and it was a dead heat. And then after several days of relentlessly insisting that Quayle had been pulverized, the poll was taken again, and it was 2-1 that Quayle had lost. But nothing had changed about the debate in the interim, other than people having propaganda barked at them.
That's right. To an incredible degree, what shapes people's perceptions is not what actually happens or even what they experience themselves at the time. It's based on what is repeated to them over and over by the mass media.
And by the way, this is a little bit out of order, but I want to share with you one of my favorite Pat Buchanan lines, if I may. And I'm unfortunately paraphrasing it, but it was uttered right here on the Modest Little Tom Woods show on one of the times I had him on. It was shortly after Trump had been elected. And I was saying something, and for the life of me, I don't remember what my point was, but it was something critical of Trump. He shouldn't have done X, and Pat agreed with me that he shouldn't have done X. But then Pat concluded, but on the other hand, we have to admit that Trump is in the White House and I'm on the Tom Woods show. And I thought that was probably one of my favorite Pat Buchanan lines. I vividly remember. Now, so I guess you would have been 18 in 1996. I vividly remember the news media covering Pat Buchanan's victory in the New Hampshire primary, and they were reporting it as if somebody had come in and shot all their dogs. I mean, it was unbelievable to watch. There was no attempt to conceal how angry they were at people voting for the unapproved candidate.
There was real fear. There was a great belief that Buchanan was on his way to getting the Republican nomination in 1996. And in fact, at one point, the Dole team, so Bob Dole was considered to be the shoe-in, obvious establishment candidate for the Republican nomination in 96. At one point, and a friend of mine who was working on the Dole team later told me this, Bob Dole and his advisors were just about ready to turn over the official jet to Pat Buchanan because they thought, this is it. Buchanan's got the momentum. He's clearly going to go and prevail. And this is Buchanan's moment. One reason why I was so slow to think that Trump could achieve what he did in terms of winning the Republican nomination and then ultimately becoming president was precisely because I had seen nominations redirected by a new media narrative and by the sort of panic of the establishment back when Buchanan ran in 1996. And it's not that the, nomination was stolen from him or anything like that, not in a formal sort of fix the voting machines kind of way, but it's rather that, as we were just discussing, the media kind of all coalesced on the single narrative that said Pat Buchanan is an extremist. He's someone that will destroy the Republican Party if he gets the nomination. Therefore, all Republicans must turn against him as soon as possible. And then basically, Steve Forbes entered the race in 96, was able to draw away some of the free market Republicans who were worried about Buchanan's trade policies. And then by splitting the conservative vote between the sort of economic conservatism of Forbes and the populist right of Buchanan, you were able to then have the establishment candidate, Bob Dole, once again emerge as the frontrunner and eventually get the nomination.
Well, indeed, I think what ensued after New Hampshire in terms of the Republican establishment urging everyone to believe Pat was a fascist and all this ridiculous stuff, that was also a foreshadowing of what was to come. I mean, there's so much in microcosm here of 2023 America in what happened to Pat. And I might add, by the way, with regard to 1996, that there was long suspicion that Alan Keyes, the role of Alan Keyes staying in the race when he was getting maybe at most a handful of percentage points, was to be a spoiler to Buchanan. And some people didn't want to believe this because they liked Alan Keyes and he could give some good speeches and write good articles from time to time. But when you stop and consider that Bill Kristol was his Harvard roommate and managed his U.S. Senate campaign, well, you can't rule that thesis out. I don't know where you come down on that.
I actually am skeptical of that idea, in part because Keyes actually was the only guy to challenge George W. Bush in 2004. Keyes actually ran for the Republican nomination, even against an incumbent pro-neocon Republican president. So I think Keyes was just extremely ambitious. And I'm sure that some of the people supporting him wanted to see him drain some votes away from Pat Buchanan. But my impression is that Keyes' own ego was probably the deciding factor there. I will say, however, if you look at the long list of candidates back in 1996, and there were, I think, about a dozen people running for the Republican nomination that year, you'll see that there were a number of other social conservatives who had very little chance of getting the nomination. And one certainly gets the impression that the idea was to dilute and really reduce support for Buchanan as much as possible and to spread it out among a variety of candidates who were positioning themselves all as the social conservatives. So, example, Gary Bauer was running for president in 1996. And today, you couldn't even explain to an evangelical who Gary Bauer was. But in 1996, he was seen as being kind of a successor to Pat Robertson in some ways. And he was closely connected with, not that it was Robertson's organization, but Focus on the Family and these other branches of the Christian conservative world. And so Gary Bauer, even though he had no chance of getting the nomination, was someone who actually would divert a number of Christian conservative, social conservative votes away from Pat Buchanan. And my recollection is that there were actually a number of candidates in 96 who had that kind of profile. But that said, 96, it was still a time when the Republican establishment had a pretty strong grip on the party. And again, I was slow to think that Trump could possibly get the Republican nomination, even when he started winning primary after primary, because I was just convinced that the old Republican establishment still had as much of a death grip on the party as it had back in 1996. And I was wrong about that. Things actually have changed significantly over the course of those decades.
And I remember asking Paul Gottfried, probably in the middle of Trump's term, do you think after Trump is gone, it's just going to revert to a Mitt Romney party? Or do you think Trumpism, however you want to define that, will stay in the saddle? And he more or less said, I think it'll just go back to the establishment. So even he at that late stage was still kind of viewing it the way you had, I think, correctly thought things were in the 1990s. So I think everybody was kind of surprised at how quickly the establishment kind of crumbled. Not entirely. Obviously, there were establishment figures who were still quite powerful within the Republican Party, but look at the people they're talking about as the front runners. It's Trump and DeSantis, and they are not in the Mitt Romney mold. So there has been a change.
Yeah, and I'm not someone who puts a great deal of confidence in the Republican Party as an institution. And clearly, Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House is not something I'm terribly thrilled about. He has my last name, but that's about all I have in common with him. You've got Mitch McConnell still in the Senate, who, again, I'm no fan of. But you actually do see some significant changes. And Trump himself, and this speaks to what, the Buchanan quote you had brought up a few minutes ago, Trump had not just the moment, but he also had the personality. He had a certain kind of magic that allowed him to prevail in 1996. And those examples, a single individual like a Donald Trump doing what no one had thought possible, and in fact, what probably was not possible before he came on the scene, that's just an important lesson to learn about the importance of what we do as individuals. And actually, I feel the same way about Pat, because even though he didn't become president and he never got the Republican nomination, I actually do think that he, as an individual, made a significant contribution to the direction of history. And that if there had not been a Pat Buchanan in the 1990s, the entire intellectual apparatus of a kind of America First conservatism, kind of conservatism that gets identified with Trump. But if you want to understand trade, or if you want to understand the conservative case against foreign interventionism, you don't go to the works of Donald Trump to understand those questions. You go to Pat Buchanan's books. And this is literally happening in Washington, D.C. There are a lot of sort of young, new right conservatives or nationalistic inclined conservatives, or simply anti-establishment conservatives, who they're training themselves how to think by reading Pat Buchanan's books. They're getting A Republic, Not an Empire. They're getting The Great Betrayal. These books are changing the way they think. And if there had not been a Pat Buchanan, there would not be a coherent picture of the world to put all these ideas together with. And it's not that there weren't other intellectuals who were making a kind of Buchananite case at the same time, but they had really no mass audience, or at least not the kind of mass audience that Buchanan had. So Buchanan, I was actually thinking about this. I'm writing a column right now about Buchanan's retirement from writing his column. And the thing that occurs to me is that Pat Buchanan actually is, in one single man, a combination for the right today. He's a combination of what both Bill Buckley and Barry Goldwater were for Ronald Reagan. In the same way, I think Donald Trump is an effect in some ways of a set of ideas and an approach to politics Pat Buchanan demonstrated and articulated more than 20 years earlier. And in the same way that the conservative movement tells this story about, well, first there was Bill Buckley and he had the ideas and communicated them to a wide audience. And then Barry Goldwater emerged as kind of a champion for these ideas in politics. But Barry Goldwater didn't get elected to the White House. But then finally Ronald Reagan came and he took this whole package and was finally able to get elected and implement things. In much the same way, the right of today owes a huge debt to Pat Buchanan as both the Bill Buckley, the great communicator, and also the Barry Goldwater, the person who sort of beta tested these ideas in politics. Buchanan blazed the trail for not just Donald Trump, but I think a lot of conservatives who are active today.
Hey, folks, quick message on behalf of Movies Plus. You heard me interview Corey Tusek, who created it. And I'll say this. People on the left support each other. Neocons support each other. But do we support each other? We talk a lot about the need for parallel institutions. Well, Corey has built one, so let's support it. Movies Plus is a platform that will give you all the documentaries the other platforms don't dare show you, but not just documentaries, all kinds of interesting and exciting independent programming and outstanding entertainment across a wide variety of genres. Movies Plus is fearless and uncompromising and gives you tremendous value for your entertainment dollar. Not to mention, use promo code WOODS in all caps and get yourself 20% off an annual subscription. So go check it out at mymoviesplus.com. That's mymoviesplus.com. Use promo code WOODS in all caps to get 20% off. What I also like about Pat is that he wasn't predictable. He didn't fall into either obvious category in the sense that you could, like, for example, I think most people could probably have a pretty good sense of where Hillary Clinton stands on pretty much everything. And likewise, where somebody like Lindsey Graham stands on everything. Whereas Pat, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but it might surprise the casual observer of the American political scene that in his autobiography, he speaks with condemnation about the atomic bombings of Japan. And it was he who in the 1990s was speaking out against the sanctions on obviously on the people of Iraq. Let's just be honest about it. And saying that this was a humanitarian catastrophe and that it was a moral outrage that the U.S. government was involved in that. And there are some people who are daft enough to think that's a, quote, left-wing position. But Pat would take those positions because he actually thought each thing through. He didn't think, well, I have this ideology, and so that tells me that I'm supposed to think X or Y. He instead had a broad enough knowledge of history and indeed, I think, political thought as well to be able to draw refreshing and original conclusions rather than just fall in line with whatever the reigning party line of the day was. So that I remember when the Persian Gulf War came along in 1991, and we were building up to it in late 1990. And I was still a naive college kid at that point. I didn't understand why Pat was against that. I genuinely couldn't understand it because doesn't he know that we favor the U.S. military? I really couldn't understand it. So I like that about him.
That's exactly right. And this too I've been thinking about. Imagine how easy it would have been in 1990 for Pat to just go with the flow, to just do what all the other Republicans were doing. You had an incumbent Republican president who wanted to go to war in Kuwait to throw Saddam Hussein's forces out of that country. The Republican president was making the case for this, generally to the extent that there was a conservative media back then, which is a handful of magazines and a few other newspaper columnists. Everyone was on board with this project, with a very few dissenters. Pat Buchanan was, in 1990, he was probably, or at least arguably, the best known conservative in America. So for decades, that had been William F. Buckley Jr., but by 1990, William F. Buckley Jr. was actually already starting to kind of step away from the limelight. Buchanan was younger. Buchanan was getting, I think, to many more viewers on Crossfire, on CNN back in its glory days, than Bill Buckley was reaching on the firing line of, in the late 80s or 1990. Firing Line was a wonderful program. It's a great discussion. But Crossfire and Buchanan's media presence on those early days of cable TV, that, again, it set a model which actually is still being imitated to this very day. And in fact, in some ways, all of Fox News is kind of a legacy of the way in which Buchanan was able to present pretty firm conservative views on a cable television network, CNN at the time, that was reaching a very broad audience. And basically, Roger Ailes and others, they said, wait a minute, what Buchanan's doing is working. You could take this message, just get rid of all of, you don't need Bill Press, you don't need all these progressives around him. Just have the kind of approach to delivering the conservative message that Buchanan has, and you could get an enormous audience. So Buchanan, if he had chosen to sell out in 1990, if he had gone along with the Bush administration, later on, if he had gone along with Wall Street and with all the advocates for the checklist conventional conservatism, Buchanan would be, he perhaps wouldn't have had as large a public audience, a radio listenership, perhaps, as someone like Rush Limbaugh. But he would have been basically in the same tier as Rush Limbaugh and Bill Buckley in terms of being recognized by the conservative movement itself as one of its absolute media stars. And instead, Buchanan, at the height of his popularity, when he could have had the entire world of conservative media at his beck and call, he decided, you know what, I'm against the Persian Gulf War. And then beyond that, he continued to look at issues based on the merits that he recognized and continued to say things that basically ticked off the conservative establishment, the Republican establishment, even ticked off, and this is something you probably heard, but many listeners will not have known, he even ticked off a lot of progressives and a lot of liberals and a lot of mainstream media types who expected Buchanan to play his role as the designated conservative Republican spokesman, to play his role without deviating from the script, right? So Buchanan was basically eventually let go from MSNBC. This is a whole story unto itself. MSNBC, when it first started out in the late 1990s, wanted to be like CNN. It did not want to be a kind of left-wing version of Fox News. Fox itself was just starting out at that point, so nobody knew how far you could go with having a news network that was directed towards one side of the spectrum. Everyone thought you had to be CNN. And so MSNBC tried to have a variety of contributors that included Pat Buchanan. And so Buchanan had a show on MSNBC, and he was a frequent contributor to MSNBC. But the heads of MSNBC in Secaucus, New Jersey, they actually called him in one day and they said, "You're agreeing with some of our liberal hosts about the folly of the Iraq War, and you're criticizing the Republican president, George W. Bush. And that's not why we hire you. That's not why we put you on the air. You're meant to be the spokesman for the Republican, the single Republican position, the single conservative position." And Buchanan was not willing to sell out just because his bosses on the network were telling him that that's what they expected. Buchanan was not willing to have his involvement with the news media turn into a scripted wrestling match where you know exactly what the Republican is supposed to say and you know exactly what the Democrat is supposed to say. He continued to tell the truth all the way along. And he paid an enormous price for that. He paid a price for that at MSNBC, but he paid a price much earlier when basically his opportunity to be the sort of Bill Buckley of the 1990s was forfeited because he defied the Republican establishment and he defied Conservatism Inc. as well.
That's a really excellent point. I actually hadn't realized, but of course it makes sense, right? It makes sense. We hired you to be this kind of person and you're not turning out to be that kind of person. And so what happens now? You know, we've kind of been dancing around this a little bit because I've maybe taken for granted that people listening already know it. But could you take a minute to describe as best you can what we might call Pat Buchanan's worldview?
Yeah. A while back, you referred to this idea that it's just common sense, but I actually think that common sense itself is a pretty rare commodity these days. So the fact that Pat Buchanan was saying the things that he was saying in the 1990s and has continued to say them on through today is actually kind of remarkable and shocking. And the ability to speak a truth that everybody knows, but that absolutely no one wants to acknowledge, that takes heroism. And it also takes a certain amount of intelligence to recognize, wait a minute, there's a proverbial elephant in the room that no one is talking about. So Buchanan said basically at the end of the Cold War, America should look to America's own interests first. And that if we tried to police the world, if we tried to become a global empire in the name of promoting liberal democracy and open markets and human rights, all these nice things, that we would in fact lose our own tradition of self-governments here at home. And I think he recognized that during the Cold War, there were a number of compromises that we made with our American traditions of small government and minding our own business, that we made some changes to the way we did things for the sake of the Cold War. And again, this speaks to the idea that Buchanan was someone who actually looked at the world with fresh eyes and wasn't simply someone who went along with everyone else. He said at the end of the Cold War, well, you know what? That may have been true during the Cold War. Maybe we did have to have this deep state and the CIA and these interventions all around the globe. The Cold War is now over. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore. And that means we need to return to the kind of foreign policy that our founding fathers set out for us. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, all of them were very skeptical of the idea that America could be involved in European conflicts without becoming the same kind of conflict-torn place that Europe had been for centuries. So Buchanan is probably the most important anti-war voice on the right of the last half century and perhaps longer. Buchanan is the central tentpole of a conservatism that is skeptical of the idea that America is meant to be an empire promoting liberalism and democracy and all these other nice things, which in fact, when they have to be imposed on other countries at gunpoint and by high explosives, wind up not being so nice. And that's one of the other things that I think needs to be kept in mind here. There's this tendency for, Pat Buchanan is such a right-winger, he's such an ogre, He doesn't care about other people. Well, if your idea of caring about other people is bombing their countries and imposing sanctions that take food out of the mouths of ordinary people while the dictator of the country still lives in his mansion and gets all the luxuries he wants, you're really not advancing the things that you claim are actually your motives, right? You're not actually advancing human compassion and human rights by doing these things. You're doing the opposite. So Buchanan on foreign policy was the most distinct, the loudest, and most articulate critic on the right of the kind of foreign policy America adopted, certainly at the end of the Cold War, and really, and I think often in many respects, the foreign policy that George H.W. Bush led us down in the early 1990s. You can criticize the Cold War and how we conducted it on a number of levels, but what we did after the Cold War was even worse, because with the Cold War, there were a number of extenuating circumstances that kind of explain why we did some of the dumb things we did. Whereas after the Cold War, we have no excuses. We did it in pursuit of a complete fantasy. Now, on other issues, Buchanan is one of the great stalwarts of social conservatism, of the right to life, and, a defense of traditional marriage. But he also is someone who has always had an impatience with the approach to crime and related matters that one finds in the political establishment in America. So Buchanan was never going to make excuses for the rioters during the Rodney King riots in 1992. He's always been someone who's been a defender of law and order and a defender of the idea that, America needs to put criminals in jail, and no two ways about it. And he's always been outspoken in ways that really make the political establishment very unhappy about the injustice of things like affirmative action, about the idea that by giving racial preferences now to a minority group that had been discriminated against for a very long time, that you're sort of evening the scales, when in fact what you're actually doing is you're tilting the balance against a lot of Appalachian white kids who had absolutely nothing to do with either slavery or segregation. That the whole affirmative apparatus regime is in fact something that the political establishment in both parties uses in order to sort of assuage its own guilt, because it of course has much more blood on its hands than ordinary Americans do. So Buchanan was touching on a lot of these issues, which some of them would have been considered core conservative issues in the 1980s. But over the course of the 1990s, a lot of conservatives really didn't want to talk about them at all. And immigration also falls into that category. So immigration was something where during the Cold War, there were one set of issues. America, for a long time, basically between the years of Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s and then the Lyndon Johnson administration, America basically had a very limited immigration system. And then as a result of some of the changes brought about by Congress during the Lyndon Johnson years, you started to get this wider and wider open door. And perhaps today we have an insane system, to be quite frank, because it's one where illegal immigrants are able to get in very easily, whereas it's extremely difficult to get in as a legal immigrant, which is exactly perverse. We have to be in control of how many legal immigrants we let in, but we want to prefer, of course, people who obey the law and follow it over those who just sort of cheat and go around and risk their lives by going across a dangerous border. Anyway, so Buchanan was always very outspoken about the need for strong immigration enforcement. And that too was something that the Wall Street Journal was very unhappy to hear. And a lot of conservatives in media were very unhappy to hear Pat Buchanan championing that issue in the 1990s and beyond. And then on trade issues, here's where Pat Buchanan is perhaps most strongly at odds with many of the libertarian listeners of this program. But Pat Buchanan has always been critical of integrating China into a sort of worldwide free market economy. He recognized China as a currency manipulator and China as basically running a kind of state capitalist operation back in the 1990s. And he made some interesting connections, I wouldn't even say across the aisle, but across political barriers in forming a coalition that was very critical of the globalist free trade agenda of the 1990s. So Buchanan wound up being on the same side as Ralph Nader, the same side as Jimmy Hoffa Jr. at the Teamsters Union in the 1990s, opposing globalization, opposing NAFTA, opposing most favored nation status for China. These are the general earmarks or the general benchmarks of Pat Buchanan's policies and his ideas. But all of this is integrated by this original view of history that Buchanan exhibits in his syndicated column, in his books. He really has thought things through for himself. And so even if you think he makes mistakes in certain places, there's a reason he makes those mistakes. And they're mistakes that are made by an intelligent mind that is looking over and analyzing world history and American politics and drawing conclusions based on some very big picture questions. That's one of the most impressive things I think about Pat Buchanan, that people who just casually see him on the TV or who read the occasional column here and there perhaps don't understand, is that actually you go to his house and his walls are lined with books, and they're not books that are there to decorate the apartment and that, or the house rather. They are books there to be read and that in fact have notes in them. And he's someone who will read Arnold Toynbee and who will read some of these great historians in order to mine their insights and to synthesize his own worldview. And I think he's very admirable in that regard. And I think that other people, even if they want to reach conclusions that are quite different from mine or from Pat Buchanan's, would benefit from following Buchanan's lead in terms of taking history seriously and actually having the kind of broad reading that he does.
I think if you compare Pat and his reading of history with somebody like the late John McCain was just a cartoon. He had no profound reading of anything. He had a bunch of slogans in his head, whereas you knew Pat knew everything. He knew the quotation. He was a king of the appropriate quotation in his columns. Like, I don't know where he found them, but they were just so on target. And I will say, by the way, that not only are his walls lined with books, but I also had the opportunity to see his enviable gun collection. And these are like vintage guns that he has, partly because of his love of history. And if I may, I don't wish to judge people by how much they like Tom Woods. Dan, I try not to make that be the deciding factor. However, I will say that I do have a very fond memory from when in 2004, late 2004, my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, came out. Pat did me two great kindnesses. I mean, three. He mentioned it in his newspaper column, which was, I didn't even ask for that. Of course, it wouldn't have dawned on me to ask. Secondly, on the McLaughlin Group, they have their award show at the end of the year, like best political comeback or whatever. And the panelists would choose somebody. And the category was most original thinker. And Pat said me. And he referenced to my book. And I said, what? And I used to watch the McLaughlin Group avidly. So this was rather a shock to me. And then thirdly, in the old days, Joe Scarborough used to have a show on MSNBC called Scarborough Country at night. And Pat would fill in from time to time. So one of the times he filled in, he had me on. We did 2 segments together on the book. And he was taking me down all kinds of controversial roads. Like, as the thing was going on, I was thinking, Pat, what are you trying to do to me here? What do you want me to say on the air here with these issues you're bringing up? But it was fantastic. And he joked about it later he said, that is television that most Americans have never gotten before. So, and what was I? Some no-name kid, basically. And yet he did me these 3 kindnesses sitting where he sat in a place of, I'm not going to use the left-wing term privilege, but an established place in American life. And he did these 3 kindnesses for basically a nobody kid. And I was already fond of him, but that was very generous. And that's more, and here's the key point, that's more than we can say for the establishment libertarian world, which at the time took the opportunity to bash my book because it was too extreme. I mean, we're libertarians, but, we're respectable. Well, maybe you are, but I ain't. So Pat comes to my defense. The director of Cato or whatever attacks me. That's almost all you need to know.
Yeah, and it shows that Pat is someone who reads what is being written now. So it's one thing, to have a great appreciation for Thucydides or for Gibbon or what have you, but it's another to actually also see the up-and-coming new talents of your own time and, of people who are significantly younger than you are. And that's one of the things that stands out about Pat Buchanan. Paul Gottfried is that way as well. Paul Gottfried always recognizes he's on the lookout for young talent. And it's remarkable because usually you have someone who has reached a certain point in their career and was kind of at the top of the heap. And it's not that they're necessarily arrogant and put on airs around people who are younger and just starting out, but it's very easy for them to sort of be dismissive of young people and to say, oh, what you're saying is no better or different than what I was saying 30 years ago. And with Mr. Buchanan, that's not the case at all. That he, in fact, really is impressed by young people who are doing great work. And he is always very supportive of them. And I've been just amazed to see that. And again, it goes beyond simply not being a jerk to being actually positively interested and supportive of people who are much younger than you that you may have previously never heard of, but they're doing good work. And Buchanan has his finger on the pulse. He knows who's up and coming.
All right. Well, I guess we'll probably leave it there, but I, as always, want to thank you, Dan, for your time. but I'd like to give you an opportunity to link us somewhere where we can follow what you're doing or anything you feel like promoting. I'm sure we'd be happy to hear it.
Well, I certainly encourage everyone to visit the website of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, isi.org. I'm a vice president there. And as I mentioned, I run a student publication divisions called the Collegiate Network. So if you're a campus conservative journalist or a campus libertarian, or just someone who's not part of the crazy establishment left, if you want to have a publication of your own in print or online on your campus, get in touch with us and we will be happy to help you get started. And beyond that, I also edit Modern Age, which is a quarterly journal published by ISI. And my writing can also be found regularly in The Spectator World Edition, where I am a monthly columnist. And in fact, I'm meant to be writing my column on Pat Buchanan today as I speak to you. So listeners will have that to look forward to.
Well, I'd love it if you would send me the link when that column is published, because I'd love to read it.
I will.
And I will, of course, link to ISI. It's pretty easy to remember, isi.org, but I will still nevertheless put it on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/2276. Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.